Livy, History of Rome, 195 BC. Book 34. 1. Amid the concerns over serious wars that were either barely terminated or else looming on the horizon, there occurred an event which is trivial as far as the historical account is concerned, but which led to acrimonious debate with the passions it aroused. The plebeian tribunes, Marcus Fundanius and Lucius Valerius, brought a bill before the popular assembly to annul the Oppian Law. The law had been enacted by the plebeian tribune Gaius Oppius. Footnote. Exit footnote. In the consulship of Quintus Fabius and Tiberius Sempronius, when the flames of the Punic War were burning fiercely, and its provisions were that no woman was to own more than a half-ounce of gold, wear multi-shaded clothes, or ride a horse and carriage in any city or town, or within a mile of town. Exception being granted on the occasion of public religious rites, Marcus and Publius Iunius Brutus, who were plebeian tribunes, defended the Oppian Law, stating that they would not permit its repeal, and many eminent men came forward to speak for or against its annulment. The capital thus was filled with hordes of supporters and opponents of the law. As for married women, there was no authority and no feelings of modesty, no order from the husbands that could keep them at home. They blocked all the roads in the city and the approaches to the forum, and made earnest entreaties to their husbands when they went down to the forum. The republic was prospering, and everybody's private fortune was increasing day by day, they said. So married women, too, should be granted the restoration of the finery they once enjoyed. This large gathering of women kept growing every day, for they were even starting to come in from the country towns and administrative centers, and they were already presuming to accost consuls, praetors, and other magistrates with their appeals. But they continued to find one of the consuls at least adamantly opposed to them. This was Porcius Cato, who spoke as follows about the law whose repeal was under consideration. 2. My fellow citizens, had each of us individually resolved to preserve our rights and standing as a husband with his own wife, we should now be having less of a problem with women of a whole. As things are, our autonomy has been ground down in our own homes by female emotionality, and here too, in the forum, it is being crushed and trodden underfoot, because we have not been able to control our women on an individual basis. We are now frightened of them as a body. Frankly, the notion of the entire male sex on some island being utterly wiped out by a female cabal used to strike me as mere fable and a complete fabrication. But there is extreme danger with any group of people if one permits them to hold gatherings, meetings, and clandestine discussions. I personally have difficulty deciding in my own mind which is worse, the conduct itself or the precedent it sets, one of which is more the concern of us consuls and the rest of the magistrates, while the other pertains more to you, my fellow citizens. For whether what is being proposed to you is or is not in the interest of the state is for you to judge, you who will be voting on the matter. But this riotous behavior of the women, whether it is spontaneous or occasioned by you, Marcus Fundanius and Lucius Valerius, must certainly be blamed on the magistrates, and I do not know if it is more discreditable to you as tribunes, or to us the consuls. It is more to your discredit if you have drawn the women to stir up your tribunican revolts, and more of ours if legislation is to be accepted because of a succession of our women, as once it was because of the secession of the plebs. To be honest, I was blushing somewhat a moment ago when I came into the forum through the midst of the crowd of women. I was held back by my respect for their status and for their modesty, as individuals rather than as a group. They should not be seen being taken to task by a consul, or else I would have said, "What sort of conduct is this? All this running out into public view, blocking the streets, and accosting other women's husbands? Could you not all have asked your own husbands the very same thing at home? Have you more seductive charms in public than in private, and with other women's spouses more than your own? And yet, not even at home should the proposing or repealing of laws in this place have been any concern of yours, not if their modesty kept married women from within their proper limits. Our ancestors' will was that women should conduct no business, not even private business, without a guardian to act as their spokesman. They were to remain under the protection of fathers, brothers, or husbands. But we, for God's sake, now allow them even to engage in affairs of state and almost to involve themselves in the forum, in our meetings and assemblies. For what are they doing at this moment in the streets and at the crossroads, if not urging acceptance of the bill of the plebeian tribunes, and voting for a repeal of the law? Give free rein to their emotional nature, to this unbroken beast, and hope that they themselves will impose a curb on their license. If you do not impose it yourselves, this curb on them is merely the least of the restraints which women resent having imposed upon them by convention or the law. If we are willing to speak the truth, what they want is freedom. No, complete license in everything. If they win on this point, what then will they not try? 3. Consider all the laws pertaining to women which the ancients employed to curb their license and make them subject to their husbands. Though they are restricted by all of these, you are still barely able to keep them in order. Suppose you allow them to pick away at these laws, one by one, to tear them from you, and finally to put themselves on par with their husbands. Do you believe you will be able to tolerate them? As soon as they begin to be your equals, they will immediately be your superiors. But you may say they are protesting so that no new measures be taken against them. It is not the law they object to, but injustice. Not true. What they want is for you to rescind a law which you have accepted and passed with your votes, a law which has met with your approval after your many years of experience of living with it, which is to say, they want you to weaken all the other laws by removing this one. No law satisfies everybody. All one asks is that it benefit the majority and the state as a whole. If a person is to smash and overthrow any law that inconveniences him as an individual, what will be the point of society enacting laws which can be shortly afterwards rescinded by those against whom they are directed? I should like to hear, by the way, what it is that has brought these married ladies to run in an uproar into public places, and why they find it difficult to keep out of the forum and public assemblies. Is it so that their captive fathers, husbands, children, and brothers might be ransomed from Hannibal? Such dire fortune is far removed from our state, and may it ever be. And yet, when that misfortune was ours, you refuse to accede to the dutiful entreaties of the women. But I suppose it was not family duty or concern for the dear ones that brought the women together. It was religion. They are going to welcome the Idaean mother, coming from Pessinus in Phrygia. And what is the reason offered for this female revolt? One that is at least truthful. So we can shine in gold and purple, she says. So we can ride our carriages through the city on holidays and ordinary days alike, in triumph, as it were, after the defeat and annulment of the law, and after the capture and seizure of your ballots. And so there will be no limit to expenditure, no limit to extravagance. 4. You have often heard my complaints about the lavish spending of women, and of men as well, and not just private citizens, but magistrates too. You have heard me complain that our state is plagued with two antithetical vices, greed and extravagance, afflictions that have been the downfall of all great empires. The fortunes of our republic are improving and advancing on a daily basis, and our empire is expanding. Now we are crossing into Greece and Asia, which are replete with all manner of seductive pleasures, and we are even handling the treasures of kings. The more this happens, the more I shudder at the possibility that these things may have captured us rather than we them. Those statues from Syracuse were enemy standards brought against the city, believe me. Already I hear, too, many people praising and admiring the artifacts of Corinth and Athens, and ridiculing the earthenware antefixes of the Roman gods. But I prefer to have these gods smiling on us, and I hope they will, if we allow them to remain in their abodes. In our father's day, Pyrrhus used to envoy Cineas to solicit the support not only of our men, but of our women too, with gifts. The Oppian law, intended to curtail female extravagance, had not yet been enacted, and yet no woman accepted the gifts. Why do you think that was? For the same reason that your ancestors had no need for legal sanctions in such matters. There was no extravagance to be curtailed. Diseases must be diagnosed before cures are found, and in the same way desires appear before the laws to curb them. What brought about the Licinian law of the 500 Iugera, but the unconscionable greed for extending one's lands? What gave rise to the Licinian law regarding emoluments and honoraria, but the fact that the commons were becoming tribute-paying subjects of the Senate? Little wonder, then, that neither the Oppian nor any other law was required to limit expenditure by women, at a time when women independently refused to accept gold and purple offered to them as gifts. If Cineas were doing the rounds of the city with those gifts today, he would already have found women standing in the streets in order to take them. And yet, where some appetites are concerned, I personally cannot fathom the rhyme or reason for them. Perhaps your not being allowed something that another is allowed might cause some understandable shame or annoyance. But if everybody's level of personal adornment is standardized, what is it that each of you fears may be conspicuous in her case? The deepest embarrassment one feels is over penny pinching or one's lack of means, but the law removes that from you in both cases when you do not have precisely what you are not allowed to have. It is just this kind of leveling I cannot stand, says the rich women. Why can I not be admired for the splendor of my gold and purple? Why is other women's lack of means hidden and excused by this law, which makes it appear that they would have had, if it were lawful, just what they cannot have? My fellow citizens, is this the kind of rivalry you want to incite amongst your wives, with rich women wanting to have what no other woman can, and poorer women extending themselves beyond their means in order not to be looked down upon for not having it? Indeed, let them begin to be embarrassed about the things that should not embarrass them, and they will stop being embarrassed about the things that should. The woman able to buy from her own means will buy. The one who cannot will ask her husband. And what a sorry man that husband is, whether he accedes to her wishes or whether he refuses. For then he will see what he has not given himself given to her by another man. At the moment they are petitioning other women's husbands in public, and, what is worse, petitioning them for a law and for their votes, in some cases with success. Acceding, you are as an individual working against yourself, your own interests, and your children. Once the law ceases to curb your wife's expenditure, you will not curb it yourself. Do not think, my fellow citizens, that matters will stand where they did before the enactment of the law on this problem. It is safer for a criminal not to be charged than for him to be acquitted, and it would have been easier to bear extravagance left unchallenged than it will be now when it has been provoked by its shackles, as wild beasts are, and set free. It is my opinion that the opium law should not be repealed under any circumstances, but whatever your decision may be, I would wish it to have the blessing of all the gods. 5. After this, plebeian tribunes, who had declared that they would interpose their veto, added a few words in the same vein. Then Lucius Valerius spoke as follows on the motion which he had himself proposed. Had it been only private citizens who had come forward to speak for and against the proposal which is before us, I too should have awaited your vote on the matter in silence, believing, as I would have, that enough had been said on both sides. As it is, a most eminent man, the consul Marcus Porcius, has made an attack on our proposal, using not merely his authority, which itself would have carried enough weight, even without a word being spoken, but also a long and diligently prepared oration. I must therefore make a brief response. The consul, however, has spent more words on a criticism of married women than on rebutting our proposal, to the point of making it unclear whether the behavior for which he was reproaching the woman was natural or prompted by us. I shall defend the personal, not us personally, against whom the consul directed insinuations rather than an accusation based on facts. Cato has used words gathering, revolt, and sometimes secession of women, because married women had asked you in public to rescind at a time of peace, when the republic was flourishing and prosperous, a law which had been passed against them in the cruel moments of war. I know the emotive words chosen to exaggerate the case, those he has used and others, and we all know Marcus Cato to be an orator who is not only stern, but on occasion even brutal, though he is by nature compassionate. For, in fact, what is strange about what the married women have done in coming forward publicly in large numbers over a matter that is of concern to them? Have they never appeared in public before? Let me open your own origins to contradict you. Listen to how often they have done it, and always you will see for the common good. Right at the beginning, when Romulus was king, when the capital had been captured by the Sabines, and a pitched battle was going on in the middle of the forum, was not the battle halted by the married women running between the two lines? All right. After the expulsion of the kings, the legions of the Volsci, led by Marcius Coriolanus, had encamped at a point 5 miles from Rome. Was not this army, which would have overwhelmed this city, turned away by our women? When the city had been taken by the Gauls, how was it ransomed? The women, of course, with everybody's consent, gathered together their gold for public use in the last war, to avoid going into ancient history. Did not the widows help out the treasury with their money when there was a financial problem? And when new gods were also brought in to give us aid in the time of crisis, did not all the married women go the sea to welcome the Idaean mother? Ah, you say, these cases are different. It is not my intention to put these cases in the same category. If the women have done nothing new, that is sufficient vindication for them. Nobody was surprised at the action they took in matters concerning the whole population, men and women alike. So are we surprised at their taking the same action in an unfair or special concern to themselves? But what have they actually done? Good heavens, masters, do not spurn the entreaties of slaves, and we have proud ears if we are annoyed at requests made of us by respectable ladies. 6. I come now to the matter at issue. On this the consul had two positions in his oration, for he was indignant at the rescinding of any law whatsoever, and at the same time at the rescinding of that particular law enacted to curb women's extravagance. The first position, the one defending the laws in general, seemed fitting for a consul, while the second, the attack on extravagance, was in keeping with the man's strict principles. There is, therefore, some danger that unless I demonstrate the speciousness of both standpoints, you may be deluged in misconception. There are indeed laws which are not temporary measures, but enacted to stand for ever because of their continued practicality. I myself grant that none of these should be repealed, unless it is demonstrated by experience to be ineffective or some political situation renders it impractical. But I also see that there are some laws that have been required by temporary emergencies, mortal laws, as it were, which can change as circumstances themselves change. Measures passed in peacetime are often annulled in time of war, and those passed in war are often annulled in peace. It is like steering a ship, for which some maneuvers are useful in fair weather, others in foul. Legal measures falling by nature into two categories. To which class then does this law, which we wish to repeal, belong? Is it a law of the kings, born when the city itself was born? Or, next best, was it inscribed on the 12 tables, by the board of 10, that was appointed to establish our legal code? If this was a law that our forefathers felt was indispensable for the protection of the dignity of married women, then we should also be concerned that in annulling it we might be annulling the modesty and purity of womanhood. But everybody knows that the law is a new one, passed 20 years ago in the consulship of Quintus Fabius and Tiberius Sempronius. For many years our married women lived without it, and had the highest morals. What danger is there, then, that they will lapse into
extravagant living if it is repealed. For if the purpose of that legislation had been specifically to repress female passions, then we ought to fear that its annulment would actually kindle them. But its real purpose will be shown by the date of its passing. Hannibal was in Italy, victorious at Cannae. He now held Tarentum, Arpi, Capua. It looked as if he was going to move his army up to the city of Rome. The allies had deserted us, and we had no soldiers in reserve, no sailors to maintain the fleet, and no money in the treasury. Slaves were being bought up to be put under arms, on the understanding that their masters would be paid for them when the war was finished. With that same date fixed also for payment, contractors offered to provide wheat and other provisions needed for the conduct of the war. We provided at our own expense slaves to act as oarsmen, their number being dependent on our tax assessment. We contributed all our gold and silver to the public weal, following the lead of the senators, and widows and orphans contributed their money to the treasury. There was a provision against our having at home more than a fixed quantity of wrought gold and silver, and of coined silver and bronze. In a period like that, were married women preoccupied with extravagant living and clothing, making an opium law a requirement to repress this tendency? At a time when the ceremonies in honor of Ceres were suspended because all the married women were in mourning, and the Senate decreed that the period of mourning be limited to 30 days, it is clear to everyone that it was financial exigency and the miseries our state was experiencing that drafted that law, because the monies of all private individuals had to be diverted to public use, and that the law would last only as long as the reason for its drafting remained with us. If measures at that time decreed by the Senate or dictated by the people to meet a temporary crisis must be kept in force forever, why then do we repay our loans to private citizens? Why do we tender public contracts on the basis of cash payments? Why are slaves not purchased to serve as soldiers? Why do we not, as private citizens, supply oarsmen as we did in those days? 7. All the other classes, all other people, will feel that the Republic's condition has changed for the better. Is it only to your wives that the rewards of the common peace and tranquility are not to be permanent? Is it only to your wives that the rewards of the common peace and tranquility are not to permeate? Shall we men wear the purple? Shall we be purple-fringed as magistrates and priests? Will our sons wear purple-fringed togas? Are we going to grant the right to wear the toga, prax texta, to magistrates in the colonies and municipal towns, along with even the lowest category of administrators here in Rome, the overseers of the wards, and not only allow them to wear such distinguished insignia in their lifetime, but also to be cremated with it when they die? Is it only to women that we shall forbid the wearing of purple? You, as a husband, are permitted to use purple as a coverlet for your bed. Are you going to refuse your wife a purple cloak? And will your horse have trappings more impressive than your spouse's clothing? And yet, in the case of purple, which deteriorates and wears out, I suppose I can see some more of justification unfair though it be, for the inflexibility. But in the case of gold, where the only financial loss is in the workmanship, what kind of stinginess is this? In gold, there is rather security for both private and public needs, as experience has taught you. Cato kept making the point that there was no rivalry between individual women because each woman had nothing. But heavens above, they all, as the class, feel hurt and vexed when they see that the wives of our allies of the Latin League have been granted the accessories that have been taken from themselves. They are hurt when they see those women resplendent in gold and purple, when they see them riding through the city while they themselves follow on foot, just as if empire lay in those women's communities, not in their own. This could wound the sensibilities of men. How do you think it affects those of our little women on whom even trivial things make an impression? Women have no access to magistracies, priesthoods, triumphs, insignia, or to gifts or spoils that come from war. Elegance, grooming, fine appearance, these are the insignia of women. This is embellishment. In time of mourning, what do they put aside but purple and gold? What else do they take up when their time to mourning is finished? In periods of public thanksgiving and public prayer, what do they take up that is special, if not finer, beautification? I suppose that if you repeal the opium law forbidding any part of what the law now forbids will be out of your hands. Daughters, wives, even sisters will have for some of you be less under your control. No, never can the subservience of women be removed while their kinsmen are alive, and yet they themselves hate the independence granted them by losing husbands or fathers. They prefer their refinements to be under your control rather than the laws, and you on your side should keep them under your care and protection, not servitude, preferring to be called fathers and husbands rather than masters. The consul used pejorative terms just now when he referred to female revolt and succession. For there is real danger of their seizing the sacred mount, as the plebes once did in their anger, or the Aventine. Note, as the weaker sex, they must abide by whatever it is that you decide, and the more power you have, the more lenient you should be in exercising it. 8. On the day after these speeches, for and against the law, were delivered, a somewhat larger crowd of women flooded the public places. In a single column, they all surrounded the doors of the Bruti, who were for vetoing the proposal of their colleagues, and refused to release the pressure until the threatened veto was withdrawn by the tribunes. After that, there was no question but that all the tribes would repeal the law, and 20 years after it was passed, the law was withdrawn. After the repeal of the opium law, the consul Marcus Porcius immediately took 25 warships, including 5 belonging to the allies, and set off for the port of Luna, ordering the army to meet at the same destination. By an edict relayed along the coastline, he also assembled here ships of all kinds, and setting out from Luna, he issued instructions for these to attend him to the port of Pyreneus, indicating that he would proceed against the enemy from there with his fleet en masse. These ships sailed past the Ligurian mountains and the Gallic Gulf, and met him on the day he had fixed. From Pyreneus they moved on to Rota, where they forcibly expelled a Spanish garrison installed in the stronghold, and from Rota they came with a favorable wind to Emporia, where the entire force, with the exception of the crews, were set ashore. 9. Even in those days, Emporia comprised two towns, separated by a wall. Even in those days, Emporia comprised two towns, separated by a wall, the one belonging to Greeks from Phocaea, mother country also of the Massiliots, the other to Spaniards, that's Massiliots. The Greek town, however, was exposed to the sea and had a wall whose entire compass was less than 400 yards, while the Spaniards' wall, lying further back from the sea, had a circumference of 3 miles. A third category of inhabitant Roman settlers were added by the deified Caesar, after the defeat of the sons of Pompey. These days they are all integrated into a single body, with first the Spaniards and then the Greeks, granted Roman citizenship. Anyone seeing them in those days, open sea facing them on one side, the barbarous and aggressive race of Spaniards on the other, would wonder just where their protection lay. What safeguarded them in their weak position was discipline, which is best preserved by fear when one is surrounded by stronger peoples. The landward part of the wall they would keep well defended, with only a single gate facing that direction, which was constantly guarded by one of the magistrates. During the night, 1/3 of the citizen body kept watch on the walls, and this was not just a matter of routine or law. They posted guards and did the rounds of them with as much care as if an enemy were at the gates. They allowed no Spaniard in the city, and would not even go out to town themselves without good reason. All had freedom of exit on the side facing the sea, but they would go out from the gate facing the Spanish town only in large numbers, that usually meaning the third of the citizens who had provided the watch on the walls the previous night. And their reason for going out was the fact that the Spaniards, who had no experience of the sea, enjoyed trading with them, wishing to purchase themselves the foreign goods imported by ship, and at the same time to dispose of the produce of their lands. Desire for such reciprocal advantages rendered the Spanish city open to the Greeks. The latter were also more secure from the fact that they lived in the shelter of an alliance with Rome, which they preserved with a loyalty equal to that of the Massiliots, though with fewer resources than theirs. On this occasion, too, they gave the consul and his army a courteous and warm welcome. Cato waited there a few days until he could find out about the location and size of the enemy forces, and spent the whole period drilling his soldiers so as not to be idle, even at a time of enforced delay. It happened to be the time of year when the Spaniards had their grain on the threshing floor, and Cato therefore forbade the purveyors to buy wheat, sending them back to Rome with the words, "The war will be self-supporting." He set off from Emporia and burned and razed the fields of the enemy, spreading flight and panic throughout the area. 10. At this same time, Marcus Helvius was withdrawing from farther Spain with a detachment of 6,000 men that he had been accorded him by the praetor Appius Claudius, when he was met by a massive column of the Celtiberians at the town of Iliturgi. According to Valerius' account, the latter numbered 20,000 under arms. 12,000 of these were killed, he says. The town of Iliturgi, no, he says the town of Iliturgi was captured, and all males of fighting age were put to death. Helvius then came to Cato's camp. The area was now out of danger from the enemy, and so he sent his detachment back to farther Spain, and set off for Rome, where, thanks to his successful operation, he entered the city with an ovation. He brought to the treasury 14,732 pounds of unwrought silver, 17,023 pieces of silver stamped with the Bk, and 119,439 silver coins with the Oscan stamp. The reason for the Senate's refusal to award him the triumph was that he had fought the battle under another man's auspices and in another man's province. He had, in fact, come home 2 years later than scheduled, after handing over his province to his successor, Quintus Minucius. He had been detained there during the following year by a long and severe illness. It therefore transpired that Helvius entered the city with an ovation a mere 2 months before his successor, Quintus Minucius, celebrated his triumph. Minucius also brought to Rome 34,800 pounds of silver, 73,000 pieces stamped with the Bk, and 278,000 pieces of Oscan stamped silver. 11. In Spain, meanwhile, the consul had his camp pitched not far from Emporii, and there. In Spain, meanwhile, the consul had his camp pitched not far from Emporii, and here 3 envoys came to him from Bilistiges, chieftain of the Iligertes. Okay, no. One more time from the top. Spain, meanwhile, the consul had his camp pitched not far from Emporii, and here 3 envoys came to him from Bilistiges, chieftain of the Iligertes, including one of Bilistiges' sons. These complained that their fortresses were under attack, and that they had no hope of mounting resistance unless the Roman commander sent help. 3,000 men would suffice, they said, and if such a force arrived, the enemy would not stay to fight. The consul's response was that, while he felt for their predicament and their fears, he had nothing like sufficient force for him to be able to diminish his strength without risk by dividing his army. Not when there were large enemy numbers in the vicinity, and he was each day waiting to see how soon he would be forced into pitched battle. On hearing this, the envoys flung themselves at the consul's feet in tears, begging him not to abandon them when they were in such dire straits. Where were they to turn if they were rebuffed by the Romans? They had no allies, they said, and no other hope anywhere in the world. They could have avoided this danger, and they decided to abandon their loyalties and join the other tribes in their machinations. But no threats and intimidation had swayed them, expecting, as they did, that they would find sufficient support and assistance with the Romans. If this proved not to be the case, and if they were refused help by the consul, then they called on gods and men to their witnesses, that they would join the uprising unwillingly and under compulsion, so as not to suffer the same fate
as the people of Saguntum, and that they would perish along with the other Spanish tribes rather than do so in isolation. 12. That day the envoys were dismissed with no response. During the night that followed, the consul was tormented by two concerns. He was unwilling to abandon the allies, but unwilling, too, to weaken his army, a move which could retard his decisive encounter with the enemy or prove dangerous in that encounter. He remained determined not to reduce his troops, fearing that the enemy in the meantime might inflict some ignominious defeat on him. The allies, he thought, should be given confidence rather than tangible aid. Often, especially in warfare, impressions have been as effective as reality, and a man believing he had the support has often saved himself as well as if he really did have it, the assurance he feels giving him hope and mettle. The next day the consul gave the envoys his answer. Although he feared that lending some of his forces to others would weaken them, he said he nevertheless took more account of his allies' perilous situation than his own. He then issued orders for 1/3 of each cohort to be instructed to cook food swiftly to put aboard the ships, which were to be made ready for sailing in 2 days. He commanded 2 of the envoys to take word of this to Bilistages and the Ilergetes, but kept with him the chieftain's son, entertaining him and giving him gifts. The envoys set out only after seeing the soldiers embarked on the ships, and when they reported this as a certainty, they saturated the enemy as well as their own people with rumors of the forthcoming Roman resistance. 13. When enough of a performance had been mounted, the consul had the men recalled from the ships, and as the time was approaching when campaigning was possible, he established winter quarters 3 miles from Emporiae. From here he would lead the men into enemy territory on raiding parties, varying the direction on each occasion and leaving a small detachment in the camp. They usually set off at night, which would enable them to proceed the greatest distance from camp and also fall upon the enemy unawares. This practice provided training for his raw recruits, and large numbers of the enemy were also taken prisoner. In fact, the enemy no longer dared proceed beyond the fortifications of their strongholds. When the consul had fully tested the mettle both of his men and of the enemy, he had the tribunes, prefects, and all the cavalrymen and centurions called to a meeting. The time that you have often longed for has arrived, he told them. The time when you have had the opportunity to demonstrate your courage. So far, your mode of fighting has been more that of robbers than warriors. But now you will meet in regular battle, one enemy against another, and then you will be able to go beyond raiding fields to draining the wealth of cities. Our fathers, when the Carthaginians had both generals and armies in Spain, and they themselves had not a single soldier there, still wanted a clause added to the treaty, stating that the river Ebro should be the boundary of their emperor. Today, we have 2 praetors, a consul, and 3 Roman armies in Spain, and no Carthaginian has set foot in these provinces for almost 10 years. And still our empire, on the side of the Ebro, is lost to us. This you must recover by your courage under arms, and you must compel a race of people engaged in a headstrong revolt rather than a determined struggle to accept once more the yoke it has thrown off. Such was the tenor of Cato's exhortation. He announced that he would lead them that night against the enemy camp, and with that he sent them off to rest themselves. 14. After attending to the auspices, Cato set off at midnight in order to take up a position at a point of his choosing, and before the enemy became aware of it, he made a detour around the enemy camp and at first light drew up
his line, sending 3 cohorts right up to the enemy rampart. The barbarians, shocked to see the Romans to their rear, themselves ran to arms. Meanwhile, the consul addressed his men, saying, "Men, your hope lies in your courage and nowhere else, and my actions have been deliberately taken to ensure this. The enemy sit between our camp and ourselves, and to our rear lies enemy territory. The noblest plan is also the safest, to have your hopes centered on your valor." With that, he ordered the cohorts to retreat in order to draw the barbarians out with a simulated flight. It turned out as he had anticipated. Thinking the Romans had lost their nerve and were in retreat, the Spaniards burst forth from the gate, filling the area between their camp and the enemy line with armed men. As these scrambled to deploy their line, the consul, who had his men ready and in order, attacked their disorganized ranks. He first of all led the cavalry into the fight on both wings. On the right, however, the Romans were immediately repulsed, and as they gave ground in alarm, they struck fear into the infantry as well. Seeing this, the consul issued orders for 2 hand-picked cohorts to be taken around the right flank of the enemy, and for these to let themselves be seen at the rear before the infantry lines engaged. The terror that this struck into the enemy redressed the balance of the fight, which the panic in the Roman cavalry had upset. But the infantry and cavalry on the right wing were thrown into such disorder that the consul grabbed a few of them with his hands and turned them back towards the enemy. So it was that as long as the battle was being fought with projectiles, the contest was even on the right flank, where the panic and flight had started. The Romans were finding it difficult to put up resistance. On the left and in the center, it was the barbarians who were under pressure, looking back with anxiety at the cohorts bearing down on their rear. When the javelins and darts had been thrown, however, and the combatants drew their swords, then the battle was virtually renewed. For now they were not being dealt unforeseen wounds, randomly delivered from afar, but with foot set against foot. Their hopes all lay in the courage and their physical strength. 15. His men were now tiring, and the consul revitalized them by bringing into the battle reserve cohorts from the second line. A new battle line was thus constituted. The fresh troops attacked a weary enemy with weapons as yet unused, at first pushing them back with a spirited charge in wedge formation, then scattering them and driving them off in flight. The enemy ran in confusion through the fields, heading back to camp. When Cato saw them in flight in every quarter, he himself rode back to the second legion, which had been kept in reserve. This legion he ordered to advance their standards and follow them at full speed to attack the enemy camp. Any man running forward and breaking ranks from an access of enthusiasm, he personally struck with his short spear as he rode between the lines, and he also ordered the tribunes and centurions to punish him. The attack on the camp now commenced, and the Romans were being pushed back from the palisade with stones, stakes, and all manner of projectiles. Then, with the arrival of the fresh legion, the spirits of the attacking force were raised, while the enemy fought more aggressively to defend their palisade. The consul surveyed the entire field, intending to burst through at the point of least resistance. Seeing a shortage of defenders at the left gate, he led the Principes and Hastati of the second legion to that point. The sentinels stationed at the gate failed to hold off their charge, and the rest of the Spaniards, seeing the enemy inside their palisade, proceeded to throw down their standards and their arms. The camp now lost to them. They were massacred in the gateways, wedged in their own numbers, and the men of the second legion cut them down from the rear while the rest pillaged the camp. Valerius Antius reports enemy dead that day to be in excess of 40,000, but Cato himself, who certainly does not underestimate his own achievements, says that many were killed, but does not specify a number. 16. Cato is reckoned to have performed 3 commendable acts that day. In the first place, he led his army around the enemy far from his own ships and camp, and proceeded to fight in the midst of the foe, where his men's hope lay entirely in their valor. Secondly, he brought in the cohorts to the enemy's rear. And thirdly, when all the others had broken ranks to pursue the enemy, he ordered the second legion to move forward to the camp gate at full speed, but in proper formation under the standards. There was no cessation of activity after the victory. When the signal to retire had been given, Cato led his men, all laden with spoils, back to camp, where he gave them a few hours of the night to sleep before leading them to conduct raids on the countryside. The raids were more wide-ranging now that the enemy were scattered in flight. This, no less than their defeat the day before, brought the Spaniards of Emporiae and their neighbors to capitulate. Many inhabitants of other states who had sought refuge in Emporiae also surrendered. Cato addressed these politely, and sent them home after entertaining them with wine and food. Cato then swiftly moved camp, and wherever the army advanced, he was met by delegates from states offering submission. When he reached Tarraco, all Spain this side of the Ebro had been brought to heel, and prisoners of war, Romans as well as allies and members of the Latin League, men who had fallen victim to various mischances in Spain, were brought to the consul by the barbarians as a gift. Then word spread abroad that the consul was going to lead his army into Turdetania, and a false report that he had already begun his march reached remote mountain peoples. In response to the empty and groundless rumor, 7 fortified towns of the state of the Burgastani rebelled, but the consul brought his army to the area and subdued them once more without significant fighting. Shortly afterwards, the same peoples revolted again after the consul's return to Tarracona, and before he left again. Once more they were subdued, only this time the conquered were not shown mercy as before. All were put up for auction to put an end to their frequent breaking of the peace. 17. In the meantime, the praetor, Publius Manlius, set off for Turdetania. With him went the veteran army, which he had taken over from his predecessor, Quintus Minucius, and to which he had added the army, also a veteran force, and had been commanded by Appius Claudius Nero in farther Spain. Of all the Spanish peoples, the Turdetani are considered the least aggressive. Even so, they confronted the Roman column, relying on their numbers. The cavalry were unleashed against them, and these immediately threw the Spanish line into disarray. The infantry engagement was almost no contest. The Roman veteran troops, well acquainted with both the enemy and the art of war, left the outcome of the battle in no doubt. And yet that battle did not constitute the end of the war. The Turduli hired 10,000 Celtiberians, and were preparing to fight with weapons belonging to others. Meanwhile, the consul, shocked by the uprising of the Burgastani, and thinking the other communities would seize the opportunity to do the same, disarmed all the Spaniards this side of the Ebro. The Spaniards were so humiliated by this that many took their own lives. They were a headstrong people, feeling a life without weapons to be meaningless.
When news of this was brought to the consul, he had the senators of all the communities summoned to him and said, "Not to rebel is as much in your interest as it is ours, for up to now this course has proved more a disaster for the Spaniards than it has a hardship for the Roman army. I think there is only one way of safeguarding against it, and that is to see that the opportunity for rebellion is removed from you. I want to attain this end in the smoothest possible way, and you, too, must help me in the matter with your advice. There is no suggestion I would more willingly follow than the one you bring to me yourselves." The Spaniards remained silent, and Cato said he would give them a few days to think it over. When they were called back, they remained silent at this second meeting as well. In a single day, Cato tore down all their city walls, and then set out against those who still refused to submit, accepting the surrender of all the neighboring peoples in each area through which he passed. Only for the capture of Segastica, an important and wealthy city, did he use siege sheds and mantlets. That's spelled Segestica. 18. Cato had greater difficulty in bringing his enemies to heel than did the Romans who had originally arrived in Spain, and for the following reason. The Spaniards went over to the original colonists because they were tired of the Carthaginian rule, but Cato virtually had to reclaim mastery over the natives after they had already seized their freedom, and he inherited a situation so turbulent that some were already up in arms while others were being forced into rebellion by siege, and these would not have held out any longer had not help been promptly brought to them. But so dynamic in temperament and character was the consul that he would personally approach and undertake every chore, great or small, not simply formulating the presiding over measures appropriate to the situation, but for the most part seeing them through himself. Nor was the rigor and severity of his authority brought to bear on anyone in the entire army more than on himself, and in simple living, vigilance, and hard work he was on an equal footing with the lowest of his men. Indeed, in his army he enjoyed no special privilege apart from his rank and his imperium. 19. As was noted above, Celtiberian mercenaries had been hired by the enemy, and these were making the war in Turdetania more difficult for the praetor Publius Manlius. Accordingly, the consul, whom the praetor sent for by letter, brought his legions to the area. When he arrived, the Celtiberians and Turdetani were in two separate encampments. The Romans immediately had some minor skirmishes with the Turdetani, against whose outpost they launched attacks and always departed victors, no matter how imprudent their engagement. As the Celtiberians, the consul ordered the military tribunes to go and discuss matters with them, offering them the choice of three options. First, they could go over to the Romans and be given twice the pay agreed upon with the Turdetani. Secondly, they could go home after being given an official guarantee that they would not be punished for having joined the enemies of Rome. Or thirdly, if they wanted war at all cost, they could fix a day and a location to decide the issue with him in the field. The Celtiberians requested a day to consider the matter. A meeting was then held, which the Turdetani attended, and at which there was such disorder as to render a decision impossible. It was now unclear whether a state of war or peace existed with the Celtiberians, but the Romans continued the transportation of provisions from the countryside and the fortified towns of the enemy, just as in peacetime, frequently entering the enemy's fortifications in groups of 10 or men or under private truces, as a commercial intercourse, had been formally sanctioned. When the consul found himself unable to entice his enemy out to fight, he first of all led out in order a number of light-armored cohorts on a raiding expedition into countryside that was as yet untouched. Then, hearing that all the baggage and accoutrements of the Celtiberians had been left at Saguntia, he proceeded to march in that direction in order to attack the town. When the enemy could be moved by no provocation, he paid off not only his own men, but the praetor's troops as well, and then returned to Ebro with 7 cohorts, leaving all the other forces in the praetor's camp. 20. With this force, small as it was, Cato captured a number of towns, and the Seditani, Ossitani, and Suestitani went over to him. The Lacitani, an isolated tribe living in the woods, remained under arms because of their natural belligerence. In addition, they were aware that they had plundered the Roman allies with sudden raids, when the consul and his army were occupied with the war against the Turdetani. Therefore, the consul led against their town not only Roman cohorts, but also the men of military age from amongst their allies, who had good reason to be hostile to him. The Lacitani lived in a town that was long, but not correspondingly wide. Cato halted some 400 yards from it, leaving some hand-picked cohorts on guard at this point. He instructed them not to move from there before he came back to them in person, and then he took the rest of his troops around to the other side of the town. Soldiers of the Sassatani made up the largest of all auxiliary detachments, and Cato ordered those to move up to attack the wall. When the Lacitani recognized their armor and standards, they recalled how often they had run about in the territory of this people with impunity, and the number of occasions on which they had beaten them in pitched battle and routed them. Suddenly they threw open their gate and burst forth in a body against them. The Suestitani barely withstood their battle cry, much less their charge. When the consul saw that matters were progressing as he had predicted, he rode at a gallop beneath the enemy wall back to his cohorts. Taking charge of these, he led them into the city, now silent and deserted, since all the townspeople had poured out in pursuit of the Suestitani. And before they could return, he took it over completely. Soon afterwards, Cato accepted their surrender, for they now had nothing left apart from their weapons. 21. The victor swiftly led his army from there to the fortress of Bergium, which was for the most part a hideaway for robbers, with raids conducted from it on the pacified country areas of the province. The chieftain of the Burgastani slipped away from there to see the consul and proceeded to make excuses for himself and his fellow townspeople. Their government, he said, was not under their control. The robbers whom they had received had brought the fortress entirely into their power. The consul told him to invent some plausible reason for his absence and go home. He added that when the chieftain saw him approach the walls and the robbers preoccupied with the defense of their battlements, he was to be sure to seize the citadel with the men belonging to his party. This order was put into effect, and the barbarians were overtaken by a twofold fear as they saw the Romans climbing the walls on one side and the citadel already lost on the other. Taking charge of the place, the consul issued instructions for the men who had taken control of the citadel to be set free, along with their relatives
and for them to be granted continued possession of their property. The rest of the Burgostani he ordered the quaestor to sell into slavery, and he executed the robbers. With peace restored to the province, he imposed heavy taxes on the iron and silver mines, and on the basis of these the province grew richer by the day. The senators decreed 3 days of public prayers in thanks for these achievements in Spain. 22. The same summer, the other consul, Lucius Valerius Flaccus, fought a successful pitched battle against a contingent of the Boii near the Latania forest in Gaul. 8,000 Gauls are reported to have lost their lives, and the others abandoned the fight and slipped away to their villages and farms. The consul kept his army at Placentia and Cremona, close to the Po, for the rest of the summer, rebuilding the sections of those towns destroyed in the war. Such was the state of affairs in Italy and Spain. In Greece, meanwhile, Titus Quinctius, handling of affairs over the winter, had ensured that the whole country was reaping the fruits of peace and independence together, and thoroughly enjoying its new status, as full of admiration for the Roman commander's restraint, fairness, and moderation in victory as it had been for his courage in war. All of Greece, that is, apart from the Aetolians, who had not gained the rewards of victory, as they had hoped, and could not long be happy with a state of peace either. Such were circumstances when the senatorial decree declaring war on Nabis, the Lacedaemonian, was brought to Flaminius. That would be Flaminius. A spelling? We've come across this name before, but anyway, let's just get it clear so you can make your own decisions about pronunciation. It's Flaminus. 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 Don't like it. Anyway, after reading it, Quinctius called for a meeting of delegations from all the allied states to be held at Corinth on a specified date. On this day, the leading citizens came together from all over Greece in large numbers, with not even the Aetolians failing to appear, and the commander addressing them as follows. The Romans and Greeks fought against Philip with a spirit and policy as unified as their motives for the war were different. Philip had violated his treaty with the Romans by, at different times, aiding our enemies, the Carthaginians, and attacking our allies here. And his conduct towards you was such that even were we to forget the wrongs done to us, those done to you would have been sufficient grounds for war. But today's question is to do with you and you alone. I am bringing before you the issue of whether you wish Argos occupied by Nabis, as you well know yourselves, to remain under that man's control, or whether you think it fair that this state of great repute and antiquity, situated in the center of Greece, should have its liberty restored and be on an equal footing with the other cities of the Peloponnese and Greece. This question, as you can see, is entirely about a matter that is your concern. It has nothing to do with the Romans except to the extent that the servitude of a single city does not allow the glory of Greece's liberation to be full and complete. But if you are not moved by concern for this city, the precedent set, or by the danger of contamination from this foul disease spreading further, then we are quite content. I am consulting you on this matter, and I intend to accept the majority decision. 23. After his address, the Roman commander proceeded with a review of the opinions of the others present. The Athenian representative, in his vote of thanks to them, was as fulsome as he could be in extolling the services performed for Greece by the Romans. They had lent their assistance against Philip when an appeal was made to them, he said, and now they were actually offering help against the tyrant Nabis without being asked. He expressed anger that such great services were nevertheless denigrated in the talk of certain people, critical of what was to come, when they should be expressing gratitude for the past. He was clearly attacking the Aetolians accordingly, and the leading spokesman of the Aetolians, Alexander, first launched into an attack on the Athenians. Once the leading advocates and champions of independence, these were now traitors to the common cause by virtue of their self-seeking obsequiousness. He then proceeded with protest against the Achaeans' recovery of Corinth and their efforts to take possession of Argos. The Achaeans, he said, had formerly been soldiers of Philip, finally deserting him when his fortunes turned. The Aetolians, by contrast, had been the earliest opponents of Philip and had always been allies of the Romans, and yet they were being cheated out of Echianus and Pharsalus, despite the agreement in their treaty that the cities and lands would be theirs on Philip's defeat. Alexander further accused the Romans of duplicity. They were occupying Chalcis and Demetrius with their garrisons after bandying about the empty term freedom. These men, who had made a practice of criticizing Philip when he was slow to withdraw his garrisons from those towns and saying that Greece would never be free as long as Demetrius, Chalcis, and Corinth were occupied. And finally, he said, they were making Argos and Nabis a pretext for staying in Greece and keeping an army there. Let them take their legions back to Italy, he concluded. The Aetolians gave their word that Nabis would either withdraw his garrisons from Argos on their terms and according to their wishes, or they would oblige him by force of arms to accept the authority of a united Greece. 24. This blustering prompted a response, first of all, from Ariston. This blustering prompted a response, first of all, from Aristaeus, praetor of the Achaeans. May Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, not permit this to come to pass, nor Queen Juno, in whose protection Argos lies, that the city be a prize set between a Spartan tyrant and Aetolian bandits, in danger of suffering more from being recovered by you than it did from the capture of Nabis. Although a sea lies between us, it does not protect us from those freebooters, Titus Quinctius. What will be our fate if they establish a citadel for themselves in the heart of the Peloponnese? The only Greek feature they possess is the language, just as their only human one is their shape. Their morals and practices are more barbaric than those of any foreigners, no more barbaric than those of beasts of the wild. They therefore ask you, Romans, to take back Argos from Nabis, and also to settle matters in Greece in such a fashion as to leave these areas untroubled by the depredation of the Aetolians. Faced on every side with unanimous criticism of Aetolians, the Roman commander declared that he would have given them a reply had he not seen everybody so opposed to the Aetolians, that they required to be mollified rather than provoked. He was, he said, content with the opinions voiced on the subject of the Romans and the Aetolians,
and he was now laying before them the question of what their pleasure would be with regard to a war with Nabis, if he refused to return Argos to the Achaeans. When they all decided on war, Flaminius urged them to send all auxiliary forces, each state according to its resources. He even sent an envoy to the Aetolians, more to bring their intentions into the open, in which he was successful, than from a hope that his request could be granted. 25. Flamininus then ordered the military tribunes to have the army brought from Elatia. During these same days he also made a reply to the embassy from Antiochus, which had come to discuss an alliance. In the absence of the 10 commissioners, he said he would not express an opinion, and they would have to approach the Senate in Rome. He then proceeded to lead the forces that had been brought from Elatia towards Argos, and was met in the vicinity of Cleonae by the praetor Aristaeus, at the head of 10,000 Achaeans and 1,000 cavalry. The two joined forces and pitched camp not far from Cleonae. The next day they went down into the Argive plain, and chose a spot for their camp about 4 miles from Argos. In command of the Spartan garrison was Pythagoras, who was the tyrant's son-in-law and also the brother of his wife. At the approach of the Romans, Pythagoras, reinforced with strong detachments of guards both citadels, Argos has 2, and other points of vantage or of weakness. But even as he was doing this, he was totally unable to hide the panic inspired by the arrival of the Romans. In addition to the threat from without, there was also an uprising within the town. There was a young Argive, Damocles, of greater courage than judgment, who initiated discussions with some prospective supporters, after they had taken an oath, about driving out the garrison. In his enthusiasm to strengthen the plot, however, he showed himself a poor judge of trustworthiness. He was in conversation with his confederates when he was summoned by an attendant sent by the garrison commander. He realized that his plan had been betrayed, and he encouraged his confederates there with him to join in taking up arms rather than die under torture. So it was that he proceeded into the forum with a few accomplices, shouting encouragement for all who wished to save the state to follow him as the champion and prime vindicator of their freedom. He persuaded none of the people, who saw not the least chance of success in the short term, and certainly no firm support for the conspiracy. Damocles was still shouting out his appeals when he was surrounded by the Spartans, who killed him along with his accomplices. Then a number of other conspirators were arrested. Most of these were executed, but a few who were thrown into prison managed to use ropes to let themselves down the wall the following night and make good their escape to the Romans. 26. The fugitives assured Quinctius that the uprising would not have been abortive had the Roman army been at the gates, and that the Argives would not sit idly by if his camp were moved closer to the city. Flamininus, therefore, sent forward his light infantry and cavalry. These fought a battle near Caelaribus, a gymnasium not 300 paces from the city, with some Spartans who sailed forth from the gates and drove them back into the city with no great effort. The Roman commander then pitched his camp in the spot where the encounter had taken place, and spent 1 day watching from there for any fresh developments. Seeing the city paralyzed with fear, he called a meeting to discuss an assault on Argos. All the Greek leaders, apart from Aristanius, were agreed, since the city was sole reason for the campaign. The campaign should start right there. Quinctius was not at all happy with this, and he listened with evident approval to Aristanus when he expressed an opinion which was at variance in the general view. He also added the point that since the war had been undertaken on behalf of Argos and against the tyrant, nothing could make less sense than the Argos should be under attack and the enemy passed over. Just to re-establish, that name is Aristanus, not Aristanius, spelled Aristaenus. That's the English transliteration. He also added the point that since the war had been undertaken on behalf of Argos and against the tyrant, nothing could make less sense than that Argos should be under attack and the enemy passed over. He was going to attack Sparta and the tyrant, he said, the source of the war. The meeting was then adjourned, and Quinctius sent his light-armored cohorts on a foraging expedition. All the ripe grain in the area was harvested and brought in, and the unripe was trampled underfoot and spoiled to deny the enemy a use of it later on. Flamininus then struck camp, and 2 days later, after crossing Mount Parthenium and passing by Tegea, spelled Tegea, he encamped at Caryae, spelled Caryae. Here he awaited auxiliaries from the allies. Before entering his enemy's territory, and 1,500 Macedonians came from Philip, along with 400 Thessalian cavalry. At this point, the Roman commander was no longer held back by lack of auxiliaries, with which he was abundantly supplied, but by provisions requisitioned from nearby cities which he was expecting. In addition, large naval forces were beginning to assemble there. Lucius Quinctius had already arrived from Eleusis with 40 ships. There were 18 decked vessels from Rhodes, and Eumenes was now off the Cyclades, spelled Cyclades, with 10 decked ships, 30 cutters, and an assortment of other craft of smaller dimensions. They also converged on the Roman camp large numbers of exiles from amongst the Spartans themselves, driven out by the wrongs of the tyrants and hoping to be restored to their native land. There were many of these men who had been driven out by one tyrant or another over the several generations since the tyrants had held sway in Sparta. The leader of the exiles was Agesipolis, spelled Agesipolis, to whose family the throne of Sparta rightly belonged. He had been expelled in his infancy by the tyrant Lycurgus, after the death of Cleomenes, first tyrant of Sparta. Lycurgus, spelled Lycurgus, Cleomenes, spelled Cleomenes. 27. Although a war of such great proportions on land and sea engulfed the tyrant on all sides, and although a realistic appraisal of his own forces and those of his enemy showed that he had practically no hope of victory, he nevertheless did not abandon the fight. He sent for 1,000 hand-picked fighting men from Crete. He already had 1,000, and he also kept under arms 3,000 mercenaries and 10,000 of his own countrymen, along with a number of the inhabitants of the rural strongholds. He fortified the town with a ditch and a rampart, and, to prevent any internal upheaval, he cowed the spirits of the citizens by intimidation and callous punishments, since he could not expect them to wish a tyrant well. Since he harbored suspicions about a number of his compatriots, Nabis led his troops out into the plain, which the local people call the Dromos. There he gave orders for the Spartan citizens to be summoned to a meeting, after laying down their weapons, and threw a cordon of armed attendants around that meeting. He then made a few prefatory remarks, explaining why allowances should be made for him in the circumstances if he was anxious, and taking all manner of precautions. It was in their own best interest, he said, that any people rendered suspect in the current state of affairs be prevented from mutinous activity rather than punished for engaging in it. He was, therefore, going to hold a number of people in custody until the storm that threatened them passed, and when the enemy were driven back, and these would pose less of a threat if only sufficient precautions could be taken against treachery from within, he would immediately release them. After this, the tyrant ordered the names of about 80 of the leading young Spartans to be read aloud, and as each answered, when his name was called, had him put under lock and key. During the night that followed, all were put to death. Next, a number of the Ilote, a country people, living in fortified towns from early times, spelled Ilotae, were accused of planning to desert and were executed after being driven through all the streets with lashes. By intimidation of this kind, Nabis had numbed the spirits of the commons effectively, deterring them from any attempt of revolution. He would also keep his forces confined to their fortifications. He thought himself no match for the enemy if he wished to decide the issue in the field, and he was also afraid to leave the city when the general mood was so volatile and unstable. When all 28. When all was satisfactorily prepared, Quinctius set out from his base camp, and the following day reached Silesia on the river Oenus, the place where the Macedonian king Antigonus was said to have fought a pitched battle with the Spartan tyrant Cleomenes. Told that the way down from here was by a difficult and narrow path, he sent men ahead by a short detour through the mountains to construct a road and arrive by way of a rather broad and open route at the river Eurotas, which flows practically at the foot of the city walls. The Romans were laying out the camp, and Quinctius had gone ahead himself with the cavalry and light armed troops, when they were attacked by the tyrant's auxiliary forces, which created panic and consternation amongst them. They had not been expecting anything like this, because they had come across no one the whole length of the march, had been passing through what seemed to be peaceful countryside. For some time there was confusion, as infantry appealed for help from cavalry and cavalry from infantry, neither having great confidence in their own capabilities. Eventually the legionary standards came on the scene, and when the cohorts at the head of the column were brought into the fray, the men who had a moment earlier been causing the alarm were driven back in terror into the city. The Romans moved back far enough from the wall to be out of javelin range, and then, forming a regular battle line, waited a short while. When none of the enemy ventured forth against them, they returned to camp. The following day Quinctius drew up his troops and proceeded to lead them along the river, and past the city towards the foot of Mount Menelaus, the legionary cohorts at the front, and the light-armed troops and cavalry bringing up the rear. Nabis kept his mercenaries, in whom he had placed all his confidence, within the wall, drawn up and ready for action under their standards, intending to make an attack on the enemy from the rear. And after the end of the column had passed, these burst forth from the town at several points simultaneously, and with the same frenzy as they had the previous day. Appius Claudius, who was bringing up the rear, had prepared his men for what was likely to happen, so it would not catch them unawares, and now he immediately wheeled around, bringing his entire column to face the enemy. And so there was a regular engagement for a time, just as if two lines in battle formation had clashed. But finally Nabis' men turned to flee, which might have involved less panic, and not the Achaeans, who knew the ground, kept up their pressure on them. The Achaeans inflicted enormous casualties, and deprived most of them of their weapons, as they scattered in flight in every direction. Quinctius pitched camp close to the Amyclae, from which point he conducted devastating raids on all the well-populated and attractive country areas around the city. When none of the enemy now ventured forth from the gate, he moved camp to the river Eurotas. He then laid waste the valley below Taygetus and the fields stretching down to the sea. 29. At about the same time, Lucius Quinctius accepted the surrender of the towns along the coastline, some of whom capitulated voluntarily, others after intimidation and force. Quinctius was then informed that the town of Gythium served as a depot for the Spartans for all their naval supplies, and that the Roman camp lay not far from the sea, whereupon he decided to mount an attack on the town with all his forces. At the time, Gythium was a powerful city, home to a large population of citizens and resident foreigners, and furnished with all manner of military equipment. Quinctius was embarking on this difficult venture when King Eumenes and the Rhodian fleet made a timely arrival on the scene. A huge force of sailors drawn from the three fleets completed in a matter of days all the preparations that had to be made for an assault upon the city defended by land and sea. The tortoise formations were brought up, and soon a start was made on undermining the wall, which was also being pounded by the battering rams. Under the repeated pounding, one of the towers was demolished, and it collapsed. It brought down the adjacent section of the wall. The Romans thereupon attempted to break through from the direction of the harbor, from which access was along more even ground, in order to divert the enemy from the more vulnerable spot, and at the same time to burst in where a path had been opened up by the breach. They were not far from gaining entry at the designated point, but their push was slowed down when they were offered hope of the city's surrender, a hope which was then frustrated. Dexagoras and Gorgopas had joined command of the city, spelled Dexagorades, Dexagoradas, whatever, and Gorgospus, G-O-R, G-O-R-G-O-P-A-S, Gorgopas, Dexagoradas. Dexagordus had sent word to the Roman legate that he would deliver the city, and after an agreement had been struck on the timing and means of doing this, the traitor was killed by Gorgopas, and the city was now defended with greater energy by the one commander. In fact, the assault on Githium would have been more difficult had not Titus Quinctius appeared with 4,000 select troops, when he had exposed to view his battle line drawn up on the brow of a hill not far distant from the city, while on the other side Lucius Quinctius was pushing forward from his siege works by land and sea. Then despair forces Gorgopas also to adopt the strategy for which he had punished the other commander with death, after bargaining for permission to take from there the soldiers he had as a garrison. He delivered the city to Quinctius. Before the surrender of Githium, Pythagoras, left as commander in Argos, consigned safekeeping of the city of Timocrates of Pellene, and came to Nabis in Sparta at the head of 1,000 mercenaries and 2,000 Argives. 30. Nabis had been panic-stricken when the Roman fleet first arrived and the towns along the coast capitulated, but he could still feel some slight reassurance as long as Githium was in the hands of his troops. Now he was told that this too had been delivered to the Romans, and that in addition to having no hope on land, since everything around him was under enemy occupation, he had been entirely cut off from the sea. He thought he should make concessions to fortune, and he first sent a message to the Roman camp to investigate whether his enemies would permit a delegation to be sent to them. When this was granted, Pythagoras came to the commander with a single assignment to gain permission for the tyrant to parley with the commander. A meeting was called, at which opinion was unanimous that Nabis be given the interview, and a date and venue were arranged. The two leaders came to some hills in the country lying between them, with a few troops in attendance. Here they left their cohorts on guard, the one visible to the other, and came down on the meeting. Nabis was accompanied by a select group of bodyguards, Quinctius by his brother, and by Eumenes, Socelus, the Rhodian, Aristanus, and Nabis was accompanied by a select group of bodyguards, Quinctius by his brother, and Eumenes, Socelus, the Rhodian, Aristanus, the Achaean, and a few military tribunes. 31. At the meeting, the tyrant, given the choice of speaking first or of hearing the others, opened the proceedings as follows. Titus Quinctius, and the rest of you here present, if you could, on my own fathom, the reasons for your declaring war on me in the first place, or waging it now, then I should have quietly waited to see what fate had in store for me. As it is, I have been unable to suppress my longing to know, before I am destroyed, just why I am to be destroyed. If you were the sort of people the Carthaginians are said to be, there is nothing sacred about an oath of alliance for them. Then I should not be surprised at some lack of concern on your part about how you deal with me, too. As things are, when I look at you, I see that you are Romans, men who reportedly hold treaties as the most inviolable of things in the divine sphere, and loyalty to one's allies is the most inviolable on the human level. Looking at myself, I can flatter myself as being a man who, on the public level, has enjoyed, along with all other Spartans a treaty of great antiquity with you, and on the private level has also enjoyed a personal relationship of friendship and alliance with you, one recently renewed in the war with Philip. But you are going to say I have violated and destroyed this relationship by holding on to the state of Argos? How am I to defend myself against this charge? By appealing to the specific facts of the case or to the timing? The facts offer me two lines of defense, for it was a case of my accepting control of the city, not seizing it. The inhabitants actually appealed to me to take it and offered it to me, and I accepted the city when it was on Philip's side, not in alliance with you. The timing also exonerates me, because my alliance with you was struck at a point when I was still in possession of Argos, and your provision was that I should send you auxiliary forces for your campaign, not remove my garrison from Argos. Heavens above, as far as the Argive question goes, I have the edge both from the equity of the case. I accepted a city which was in the enemy hands, not yours, one which came to me of its own volition, not under duress, and also on your own admission, inasmuch as you left Argos with me in the terms of our treaty. But what weighs against me is the title tyrant, and my record of summoning slaves to freedom and establishing the destitute common people on the land. As for the title, I can make this point in response, whatever my qualities. I am the same man that I was, Titus Quinctius, when you yourself concluded the treaty with me. At that time, as I remember, the title king was applied to me by you, and now I see I am called tyrant. In fact, had I myself altered the title which gives me power, I should have been obliged to account for my inconsistency. Since it is you who are changing it, you must account for yours. As for my increasing the numbers of the proletariat by freeing slaves and distributing land to the impoverished, I can, in fact, use the plea of timing to defend myself on this score too. For these measures, whatever we think of them, I have already taken at the time when you concluded the treaty with me and accepted my assistance in the war against Philip. But suppose I had taken them only recently, I would not be saying to you, how could I have harmed you or violated the treaty with you by that? But rather, I should be arguing that I acted in accordance with the ways and institutions of our ancestors. Do not gauge what happens in Lacedaemon by the measure of your own laws and institutions. There is no need for a detailed comparison between the two. You choose your cavalry and your infantry by assessment of wealth, and you want a few to transcend the others in riches, with the commons subject to these. Our lawgiver did not want the state to rest in the hands of a few men, the body you call the Senate. And he did not want one or another class to be preeminent within the community. Instead, he believed that a leveling of affluence and rank would lead to a large number of men bearing arms for the fatherland. I have, I confess, spoken at greater length than is in keeping with our native succinctness, and a brief summing up could have gone as follows. Since entering a compact of friendship with you, I have done nothing to make you regret that compact.